Can you hear me? If you can't, say no. Well, tonight I'd like to talk about nothing. I know there are lots of people who have had this ambition to be able to talk about nothing and make sense. And so I'll try to make nothing sensical for you. So we'll start with the void, and we will start in the void with the first distinction. And I'm borrowing this from G. Spencer Brown in his Laws of Form, a book which is now published in this country by Julian Press in New York. So let's take this blackboard as being a sample of nothing. Now, there's nothing on the blackboard, and if we want to make a distinction, we have to make some sort of a mark. So let's just make a circle. As soon as we make this distinction, demarcating a portion of the void from the rest of the void, we have accomplished something which wasn't there before. And you could call this the first creative act, though in reality it's the second creative act. The first creative act was getting yourself out of the void. Each of us has come out of the void, taken on a material form, which is described very well in our Western science, and functioned as a more or less independently operating member of a network. So, the first distinction, number one, is the creation of self. Now, we each of us have the illusion that our self was created by others, that our self was created by our parents, by our peers, by our teachers, by our political definitions of who we are, by our race, by our creed. But this is an illusion. If you pay close attention to yourself in solitude, isolation, and confinement, you will find, after you've spent a sufficient number of hours, for a sufficient number of weeks, for a sufficient number of years, that you created yourself, and that you started as nothing, and then you became self. So the first distinction, this boundary, is drawn around self. That self can then operate in such a way as to draw further boundaries. So it can reach out, as it were, and make the second distinction. This is where G. Spencer Brown begins the Laws of Form, is separating out from a universe of nothing, something, which you now name. As soon as you can name, you can distinguish, you can separate, and you can cross over into. So self can move over the boundary into the new space. Now remember, you've done two creative acts here. You've created self, even though you can't remember it, but maybe you can remember the first distinction that you made. The first conscious distinction was probably made as you were leaving the uterus, or as you were entering the uterus. In some cases, it's the entrance that is remembered. In other cases, due to the traumatic nature of the birth, It's the birth that's remembered. If you go back to the earliest, most primitive memory that you have, you will find something of what I'm speaking here, if you are allowed to. Now, this is a region in which what you believe to be true either is true or becomes true within certain limits. These limits are to be found experientially and experimentally. Now, experientially and experimentally mean that the responsibility is yours. Experiment, as defined in the Western world, is something that somebody does to something to test it, to elicit new information. So you can experiment with yourself, you can experiment with the void, you can experiment with distinction. Now, if you go along with G. Spencer Brown's definitions, that distinction is perfect continence, that is a totally enclosing boundary of some sort, and that this boundary has an inside and an outside, and then you name the inside, and we're naming this one 2, you can then remember that you did this operation, you store it. And if you recall it, it's the same operation that you did when you named it. So the calling and the recalling are the same. Now this is a pretty primitive mathematical kind of definition. You are reducing many operations to one operation and making it a call here. If you move across the boundary from one space into space, we call this the first space. This is the 0 space outside. If you go from 1 to 2, you are doing the same operation that you did when you went from 0 to 1. This operation is called crossing. Now, if you go from 2 back to 1, you are recrossing, and that is not the same operation. To summarize it in a particular way, you can lose your virginity only once. When you cross from 0 to 1, you've lost your virginity, and crossing back to 0 is not the same operation.
You're losing your virginity twice when you cross the 2.
In a sense, but it's a new virginity.
It's not the same operation.
That's right. Here you are alone.
You define them as the same operation.
The cross and the recross are not the same operation.
No, but you define 1, 0 to 1 and 1 to 2 as the same operation.
In the primitive sense, this is true. In the historical sense, it's not. In the sense that you can only move from 0 to 1 and then from 1 to 2. It's a different operation. But we're reducing that to a single operation for purposes of making a more general argument and taking time out of it. In 0, there is no time. There is no space. There is no concept. The original creative act brings all of these into being simultaneously. Now, as you can see, if you do move into 1 out of 0, you never again can move back to 0 totally innocent. So far as we are concerned in this particular kind of a reality. Now, if we do it, we then can carry no memory of the operation with us back to 0. Because in 0 there is nothing, including memory. Nothing stored there. Now, it's wise to meditate on this kind of operation in the sense that if you can face this set of operations, face your own non-existence, face your own creation, face your own destruction, you are doing what Carlos Castaneda said Don Juan told him to do. You are keeping your death on your left hand. This operation keeps you more alive, more aware, and more of a higher level of consciousness than any operation that I know of. As long as you do not worship your own destruction. As long as you do not overvalue your own creation. We have a tendency to have an aversion to our destruction, the destruction of this vehicle, this body in which we live. And we have a tendency to hang on to it and not leave it, as if this were our total being, our total existence, our total creation. Now, if it is, there's nothing we can do about it. If this is our total creation, if we are merely an aggregate of molecules that has been accumulated by a biophysical universe which has no meaning, no direction, no self independently of the molecular aggregates of our body and brain. It's a pretty empty universe for that particular molecular aggregate. It's a lonely place without much point. If these operations have any reality or any truth to them at all, then there is a far greater hope for a spiritual growth, for an expansion of our awareness, and for an increase in our knowledge of how the universe really operates. This is my particular point of view at this time. That's where I'm at. From that point on, one can open up any can of worms that one can conceive of. If you can take in the statement that I made earlier, what one believes to be true either is true or becomes true in the province of the mind. I want to amplify in the province of the mind in a minute. Within certain limits, which are to be found experimentally and experientially, and when so found, are found to be further beliefs to be transcended. Those of you who are interested in mathematics will recognize this as a non-terminating infinite series, a non-converging infinite series, which, if you follow it, can expand your awareness into regions which currently you are not willing to go into, or have not been willing to go into. It is a set of directions to move into the void or anywhere else that you can conceive of. There are travel folders called science fiction that you can follow and test for your own experiential and experimental guidance. There are other manuals around of various sorts from the esoteric schools, the mystical schools, and from theoretical physics and modern science. Take, for example, from the latter group, the study of quantum mechanics. Get into the submicroscopic world of quantum mechanics, of the very peculiar logics, plural, which are necessary to function in the area of that submicroscopic world. Study von Neumann and Szilard's paper of 1936 on the quantum observer. Study Robert Edwards' thesis at UCLA on a brain prosthesis. you get it then into the region through modern science of a study of your own brain and the quantum mechanical aspects of its own operations. As soon as you do this, you will find that you're entering into spaces, into regions, into states of consciousness, which previously have only been described in the mystical literature, in the Western Christian literature, and in the modern drug literature, in the psychedelic literature, so-called. There are many, many routes into these spaces, and the amazing thing to me is the correspondence of the people who have been traveling in these spaces. Let's take the case of Franklin Merrill Wolff. In 1936, after 20 years of work on the yoga of Patanjali as presented by Shankara, Merrill Wolff suddenly was able to achieve a transformation in his consciousness without drugs and without overwhelming bodily disaster. The usual way that people get into these spaces is having a close brush with death, some sort of a disaster entering into their life, coming back and suddenly realizing what their life is, the realities of it. This seems to be the most common way that people get into these spaces. And they can then suppress the information, or they can go on and expand their awareness into the regions. Franklin Merrill Wolff did it the hard way. He was a physicist and a mathematician, and he decided he was going to try to do it by sheer intellectual programming. In a 6-month period in 1936, he achieved it. And on August 8th, he moved into a region of extreme light, of extreme new knowledge, which before he did not know and had not programmed in, had not been given to him. And as the days progressed, he stayed in this space. He was at a place in Northern California running a crosscut in a gold mine all by himself, reading Shankara and meditating on the meaning of consciousness without an object. This is the pure consciousness of self, as it were, without a body, without an external reality, and without connection to other humans on this planet. It's the meditation on the void. Again, we're coming back to that, as we'll keep coming back to it. The meditation which sets up consciousness as the primary process in the universe. This is quite contrary to modern natural science basic assumptions. According to modern science and the natural biological bases, consciousness is the result of conglomerations of molecules in particular living structures in particular forms, and man tends to worship his own brain as being the conscious brain as a result of its particular evolution. Well, as you know, I've looked at other brains, other biological organisms with brains as complex and larger than ours, and found that we're being rather arrogant about assuming that we are the only conscious beings on this planet. We don't know about the rest of the universe. But if you proceed from another set of assumptions in which consciousness is primary and matter, energy, and space are secondary, a la Shankara and some of the Eastern philosophers, you quickly arrive in these spaces that we've been speaking of, very rapidly. In other words, your awareness becomes that particular gift which has been given to you somehow out of the void out of nothing. It has been moved into you whether you liked it or not. And you as an individual, as it were, do not realize your connection with the rest of the consciousness of the universe until you are forced to by a severe discipline, which today we call spiritual, and which later, I imagine, in the future years, we will call scientific. I think we're going to move into a series of sciences, new sciences, which have ancient roots in the East, among the Buddhists, among the Tibetans, among the Hindus, and among the Chinese. And gradually, we will see that these sciences have been furthered in the East beyond anything that we have accomplished in similar areas here. However, this apparent disparity between the East and the West, I'm sure, will be erased. Let me give you a very simple-minded example. Here in the United States, we have a system of meditation which was invented here. It is probably the most dangerous form of meditation that the world has ever seen. It requires a high degree of skill. It requires a person to learn it when they are rather young, and they must practice it for many hours every year in order to survive. If they don't practice it, they become a member of the 55,000 lives that are lost every year as a consequence of failure to perform this meditation in an expert fashion. And this is driving a car on a freeway at 70 miles an hour. You must keep that car within a 14-foot wide lane at a very high rate of speed, 60, 70 miles an hour after hour. Now, if you pay close attention to what you're doing under those circumstances, you will find that it has all of the characteristics of an esoteric meditation from the Far East. Number one, it requires your total awareness focused in a given region. As you move down that highway in this narrow channel, you are beset with people doing a similar job, but at different rates than you are. They turn in front of you. You must be aware of them coming in from the sides. You must be aware of them coming at you from the opposite direction. This is a very, very demanding form of operation. The concentration required is obviously of a very high order. And if you fail to do it, the penalty is the death of this vehicle. Now, the amazing thing is that there are so few deaths compared to the number of man-miles covered per year. There are good statistics kept on this, and you can check out the facts of it very easily. Now, it's been discovered by the younger generation, some members of the younger generation, that they can do this operation very easily and at the same time get out of their body. For example, I have a friend who drives his car about 3 feet above the car practically all the time when he's on a freeway, because he finds that it's a better vantage point to see what's going on around him. Now, he says, I asked him for a complete description of what this is like, and he says he watches the body below him operating the wheel as a robot that is aware of what is necessary to keep that car in a safe condition under these particularly tough conditions. And I said, well, what are you doing all this time? He said, well, I'm watching the body, and at the same time I'm watching ahead from up at the top of the car, And every so often I tell the body, you know, hey, way down there, bud, there's something coming, you better pay attention. And the body pays attention, and then everything goes fine. This happens to be more common than appears on the surface. I've found that if I can get the confidence of various young people, that they will tell me about such experiences. There may be one or two such experiences, or it may be a routine thing with them. Or it may be only when they are stoned.
All right.
Now, what is being stoned? Andy Weil, in his new book called The Natural Mind, divides the thinkers into two kinds of thinkers, the stoned thinkers and the straight thinkers. Stoned thinking involves several parameters which are very difficult to describe for those who haven't been in the space. In fact, if you haven't been in the space, no description will help you. If you have been in the space, I don't have to describe it. So again, what you believe to be true either is true or becomes true within certain limits, to be found experientially and experimentally. So to be stoned is one of these spaces where you've changed your whole belief structure, where you've moved in away from a set of beliefs of the consensus reality into a set which are far freer and more flowing. Now, I finally tracked down Merrill Wolff, and I found that he's a far-out gentleman of 85 years old, living at 6,000 feet on the side of Mount Whitney. He has owned land on the side of Mount Whitney since 1930, and he said that part of his experience was that he was told to move beside a big mountain in order to stay high. Well, Tony and I last summer decided that we were going to find out about this business about mountains and the Tibetan plateau and staying high. Now, the Tibetan plateau, as you can see from Lama Govinda's book, The Way of the White Clouds, the average level of that plateau is 14,000 feet. And some of the sacred places of the Tibetans are up at 18 to 20,000. So we decided to go see what this was like. So we spent 6 weeks above 7,000 feet in the high Sierras in a motorhome and found out it's literally true that if you get high on the mountains, you can stay high. Now, of course, it can be a bummer, too. As anybody who knows stone thinking, it either goes one way or the other. It rarely stays dispassionately in the middle. But if you're very careful and eat the right food, drink the right water, and get lots of exercise, and stay at high altitude, you can stay high, stay stoned. And stone thinking is very much easier as long as you're slightly anoxic. Now, during World War II, I would estimate something like 1,500 hours above 38,000 feet on pure oxygen in high-altitude chambers. And we did a lot of stone thinking, but we didn't call it that then. We called it anoxic thinking, lack of oxygen type thinking. But I noticed that certain people in the group that I was working with at the University of Pennsylvania got addicted to this. And at every chance they took a trip to the equivalent altitude of 38,000 feet on pure oxygen. I didn't particularly take to it because I got a negative reinforcement by getting the bends. I did not pre-oxygenate because we were doing bends research and I was one of the subjects. So one way, of course, of getting a negative Skinnerian view of all of this is to get the bends, or to have an accident at altitude, fall off a mountain, break a leg skiing, or any of these other ways of going on a bump in the mountain. And there are lots of them. I once had a mountain lion, for instance, track me over up here at Mount San Gorgonio back in the 30s. I didn't know he was tracking me until I came back down the mountain, and right beside my tracks I saw these cat tracks about this big. I thought twice about sleeping up there that night, but then since I'd seen a herd of deer, I thought he probably would figure that the deer were more easily eaten than I was, and that, but I didn't sleep much that night, which is another way of having a bummer in the mountain. Now, in a motorhome, notice I'm giving you the program here of how to have a high in the mountain. First, you get a motorhome. Now, this last spring, when we were up on Tioga Pass, Tuolumne Meadows, a bear came by at dusk. He stood about this high on all fours, and he was an impressive cut. And we happened to have parked a motorhome right across this trail. So as he came straight at the side of it, he suddenly realized it was there and went around it like that and then straight on up the mountain, practically ignoring our presence. That is an advantage of the motorhome versus a tent, because he then went on up the hill and proceeded to get into some garbage cans, by which some of our friends were asleep in the tent. They heard him in the garbage cans and scattered for their cars. Okay, so the mountains by themselves are not the answer to the high spaces. But if you can arrange to live there, as Merrill Wolfe has, it's much easier to change your states of consciousness into the stone states without benefit of illegal substances. Now, it's a mistake to go, say, to 14,000 feet and take any of these illegal substances, because all you'll get is a sound sleep. So you'll find, for example, that in countries where hashish and various things are available freely, that the mountain people, in general, are very, very sparing in their use of these substances. They are not needed. But you'll find that people down near sea level need them. So there seems to be some sort of an inverse relationship between methods of getting stoned by means of plants and chemicals and the altitude. It would be interesting to do some statistics on this and back this up. This is my impression. Now, this is a long preliminary to Franklin Merrill Wolfe on the side of Mount Whitman. He's lived there continuously, practically, since 1930. He does not take students, except at a long distance. He's making use of the modern tape recorder to teach. So he sits in his mountain eyrie, dictates his lessons, ships the tape off to Arizona, where the students are, and they sit down and listen to his lessons. Now, his first book, Pathways Through to Space, was published in 1944. He had made his transformation in consciousness in 1936. He wrote for 6 months, then he wrote again a year later, and he filled in the experiences. If you can find this book, Pathways Through to Space, a personal record of a transformation of consciousness, it's well worth reading. I recommend it to you very highly. For those of you who want to do an intellectual transformation in consciousness without chemicals or without the rather boring methods of the esoteric schools, this is a sort of a groovy textbook. It's being republished at my insistence by Julian Press in New York, who published my book, Center of the Cyclone. And it should be out this spring or summer. It'll be available once again. It's a very hard book to find. There was a very limited edition during wartime conditions. Now, he's got a second book, which I've seen in mimeograph form, which he's written mainly for his students, but which should be published. But it's a 600-page manual on the philosophy of consciousness without an object, in which he relates his particular transformations to all of the modern schools of philosophy. It's a very erudite and scholarly work, and also a very powerful manual on how to change your consciousness. And if you pay close attention to what he's doing, is he's examining the belief structure which led him to his transformation. He's presenting to you that belief structure in relation to other schools of philosophy. So that the consciousness without an object school of philosophy says, number one, its basic assumption is that consciousness is. In other words, consciousness precedes all else. And it is the creator. It is that which moves in the universe. It is a very ancient view, and so what's new? The new thing is that a mathematician and physicist has started to examine this with the logical rigor required by Western science, and then to present the results to you. Now, he speaks of spaces which resemble some of the spaces that I've talked about, that I've been in the center of the cyclone, which are adjacent to and parts of adjacent spaces. There's some overlap. He speaks of the region of high indifference, the state of high indifference. Now, if we want to go Skinnerian, we can say that there are two things which keep you from changing your consciousness. Number one, there's negative reinforcement. Which potentially stated very succinctly when he said that pain causes aversion. In modern behavioral psychology, aversion is the equivalent to avoidance. Two, the second trap, and these are traps if you wish, these prevent you getting to the state of high indifference. Positive reinforcement. Pleasure causes attachment. Now you can look this up in Patanjali, his sutras, which he apparently wrote about 300 BC, though his dates are a little sloppy. He wrote 196 sutras. These are two of them, which come right up to your Skinnerian modern view in terms of the total human being. Now, if you can avoid negative reinforcement, and if you can avoid positive reinforcement, if you can avoid allowing any space, any state of consciousness, any group, any institution, or yourself, causing either of these, you can then get into the state of high indifference, which is neither of those. It's a sort of a surfing slot. And those of you who have surfed know what I mean. When you're in the slot on the surfboard, you're neither lagging the wave nor leading the wave. You're neither going to get dumped nor are you going to get left. You're riding right on the right spot. And there is only one spot on any one wave. So if there's neither falling behind, the aversion to the wave, nor the attachment to the front of the wave, there is that particular place in which you move neither forward nor back, in which you have your balance point.
How can you remove that slot from pleasure?
By not being attached to pleasure.
Well, you're attached to a slot. You know, you're attached to something. As a matter of fact,
You're
positive
achieving the
reinforcement
slot.
Doesn't require pleasure. Negative reinforcement doesn't require pain.
What is your point?
If pleasure and pain don't enter into it, if you're going to say that you're attached to the slot, Skinner would call it pleasure.
No.
Couldn't you be
No.
referred to the slot?
What do you mean?
Let's give you another example. Some activity that you want to do gives you extreme pleasure, ecstasy. Now, the Patanjali trap of the ecstasy is being attached to the ecstasy and wanting to have it reoccur again and again. The repetition. The problem with the pain is avoiding that which causes pain rather than going into it and discovering its causes and thus knocking the pain down. Avoiding situations which cause pain.
Well, once you've been in that slot, the only way that you can talk about it is if you want to get into it again, or you enjoy it, or you want it to reoccur. You're after the repetition then.
Well, if you want to live without these two, as it were, you just eliminate them and stay in the space where they are not present.
Well, the wave breaks eventually, and you have to go back out again.
Okay, say that you have a wave that goes on around, say, in the roaring 40s. It just goes around Antarctica. I don't think anybody surfed there. It's a little cold, and you require a lot of characteristics. Yeah, a real wetsuit. Okay, we're speaking now in terms of a metaphor and a feeling and a state of experience, which I was trying to get across for those who have done surfing. Now, if you're a skier, you can get in the same position. You can either come down a mountain, hell-bent for leather, not caring whether you get destroyed or not, and end up in the top of a tree with a couple of broken femurs, or you can come down a mountain not being afraid of going into the trees, but at the same time doing that which is necessary to avoid going into the trees, staying in the slot again. Now you can, as it were, get addicted to this. Or you can come down the mountain so frightened and so attached to going slowly that you never get anywhere. Now, an excellent performance is a dispassionate performance in the sense that you do not allow yourself to get so ecstatically excited that you lose control, nor to get so frightened that you lose control. And that's generating a slot in this sense that we're talking about. Now, traveling in inner spaces, you have to have this kind of knowledge also, in a sense, because we are all too likely to fall into negative spaces, bummer trips if you wish, or into extremely ecstatic spaces, sort of like continuously staying on the edge of a sexual orgasm, but never going over, and staying in that ecstatic space. These kinds of spaces are both traps in the Merrill Wolf sense. The state of high indifference allows a freer travel into farther out regions than either of these other two possibilities. In other words, falling into hell or seeking heaven are two activities which militate against achieving the high indifference state.
Yeah, but maintaining that homeostatic position, wouldn't that in itself...
It isn't a homeostasis. It's a steady state. Very different.
Yeah, but maintaining it is homeostasis, and it would become positively reinforcing.
Right, but positively reinforcing at the next level up.
You mean a secondary reinforcer? It could be a curve.
We could call it a meta-reinforcement.
Doesn't matter.
All right, let's not get lost in the screen of words. Let's say I've mapped it out to a certain extent for you here. We can discuss the details and get the point across as we go. But the important thing to remember here is that everything I've been saying is not just a bunch of words, a bunch of formulae. It's based on direct experience of the people that I'm mentioning and also myself. And each person who has been in these spaces struggles with the problem of communicating them to others. It's impossible, in my estimation, to transmit the experience directly to someone who has not been anywhere near these spaces. Arguing on a verbal level, using verbal constructions, even as I'm doing here, have no use whatsoever unless they can be like a cookbook, unless the injunctive use of language is remembered. All that Merrill Wolfe, or myself, or Carlos Castaneda, or Don Juan, or G. cookbook, unless the injunctive use of language is remembered. All that Merrill Wolfe, or myself, or Carlos Castaneda, or Don Juan, or G. Spencer Brown can do is to lay out a map and tell you you can move from this part of the map to this part of the map by the following means, and then give you a set of directions. You don't ask a cook or someone who writes a cookbook does not try to describe the taste of the food. What he does is give you a set of directions, a list of materials, and the proper way to combine them and to cook them for you to taste it. And the result is a direct experience of taste, which you can only arrive at by following the injunctive use of language in the cookbook and following the directions. And that's what Merrill Wolfe is doing, and that's what I've been attempting to do in Center of the Cyclone.
How do you get to explore? Or how do you...
He isn't ready to face the ally yet.
No, he's not.
That's book number 4.
Yeah.
He's going to be scared shitless, too. I haven't met Carlos Castaneda yet, but I'm sure that, book 4 is in the offing. It's going to be waited for. We have to get that next chapter. We all need it. He's been shown the territory where the ally is, but he won't enter it yet. Okay, with that I will ask for questions and see where we're at.
Yeah, I'm a little dubious myself about the effect that extroceptive reinforcements can have when you're in a state of stone thinking. Do you think it's possible that you could manipulate the environment to help a person reach the state of stone thinking if they've never been there?
Yes, by eliminating it.
Would you call that? What I'm saying is, do you think you could apply, Skinner's analysis of that by saying that you're creating reinforcers to shape the person to the point where he reaches stone thinking?
Well, I spent several years working with monkeys, working with cats, working with rabbits, working with dolphins, using positive negative reinforcement, shaping, and so on. And if you want to read about that, there's a paper in the 1968 June issue of the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America called Reprogramming the Sonic Output of Tertius Truncatus, in which I state that which I have found over a 15-year period, which was relevant and irrelevant to the Skinnerian philosophy. We must always remember, number one, that Skinner based his work on Pavlov. Pavlov was a physiologist, and he discovered that if you isolated a dog in a sufficiently bland and even environment, that the dog became a conditionable object. And positive and negative reinforcement must be remembered on this basis. Later, Skinner introduced various operands into this box, levers, in various ways of bringing reinforcement into the box. I spent years with monkeys with electrodes in positively and negative reinforcing areas of their brains and learned this thing thoroughly. Skinner came, visited my laboratory, and I said to him, "Your people say that you don't care whether the head is full of cotton wool or not. I want to show you some detailed mapping of positive and negative reinforcement places." So we went through the maps. And he said, as he was leaving the laboratory, he said, "Oh, by the way, I never said that. That was one of my graduate students." So, as Jung said to Alan Watts, "I'm not a Jungian." Skinner said to me, "I'm not a Skinnerian."
Could we come back to the development of the formation of the cell? Because I've always come under the impression that the cell isn't something that generates itself, but it develops by virtue of its contact with others. And I think there's an awful lot of evidence to support that. Children dying in hospitals where they're not cared for, experiences in concentration camps, children in isolation, and so on. And I think we don't grasp what you're saying here about the formation of cells comprised of others.
Right. There's a lot of work done on this. The deprivation experiments are very well done. There's a lot of work showing, for example, that vision will not develop if chimpanzees are raised in the dark. Various things in the vehicle will not develop unless they're used. Interactions with others, as Margaret Brenneman has shown, are absolutely essential for the, quote, normal development, unquote, of human children. Rene Spitz's work in an unknown South American republic of children neglected in an institution and dying at the age of 6 months is kind of convincing evidence of this. This isn't my point. That everything that's said there is perfectly true in regard to the vehicle, in regard to the human brain, and to the acquisition of that which we value in the human. This other that we're speaking of is a self, the consciousness, the original primitive consciousness, the basic material out of which
Animal consciousness, how do you relate to dolphins?
Wait a minute, he's still asking me. Well, have you ever been in solitude and isolation and confinement yourself for a long period of time? How long? And how severe was your deprivation? Yes, I hate this term sensory deprivation. I never felt deprived. It was groovy. It's a great trip. In fact, you can get extremely high under these conditions, especially if it's sufficiently dark so that there's no light whatsoever, and sufficiently quiet so there's no sound, and if you're floating around so that the gravity resisting forces are minimum. I agree with you that this is a great trip. Okay, so that if you study under these conditions who you are, and you go through the Ramana Maharshi exercise, who am I, and do this deeply so that it has meaning, and then throw away all those answers as they come up, you can probably, Western man can probably move his consciousness faster into the regions I'm talking about than by any other technique. The who am I reveals to you what I'm talking about in terms of the pervasiveness of consciousness. You get into a space which in the center of the cyclone I call +3, in which you're interconnected and identified with all the other sentient beings in the universe. You are no longer an individualized ego self. You are sharing and being, the total being, billions in a network. You are the network. And the surprise is in store for you when you come back from that space and are squeezed into this particular vehicle. Experiences like that, experiments done in that particular way in solitude, isolation, confinement, are pretty convincing for those who are willing to go through that kind of thing. You must be willing to lose, totally lose, the sense of identity of a unique self in a particular body. If you're going to hang on to that, you can't get anywhere with these experiments. As Charlie Tart says, the new science of the observer is going to be of observers in special states who can then observe special experiences. And you must respect, in these new sciences, in this area, you must respect the personal report of the observers. In other words, the observers are assumed to be reliable, assumed not to be liars, and if you test them, bear out your particular own experiences in the same spaces. Now the problem here is consensus testing in the natural science technique method. Can somebody else reproduce the experiments? Or do they just reproduce the report? Anybody who's been in these spaces can recognize when somebody else has been in the spaces. Anybody who has not been in the spaces can't do much with it. Now that's one of the problems of this area, and that's why the esoteric schools are esoteric. Not because they want to push secrecy onto people because what they will learn is too dangerous or something of this sort, but because you can't transmit the information until you've had the experience. Now this is just about as true. Pardon?
That's contrary to the idea of a cookbook.
No, it's not. A cookbook can only be used by cooks. I take it you're not a cook.
That sounds to me like it's sort of contradicts what you just said about recognition. It seems to me that given that you've occupied these spaces, what you've said argues that if you are occupying them, that you're fairly inarticulate about those spaces while you're there.
Yeah, lots of times you can't even speak. In fact, you're gone.
Fine. And so then you have to come back and talk about it later when you're not there.
Right.
And if that's the case,
If you're going to talk to somebody in this consensus reality, that's true.
well, that's what a cookbook is.
Yeah.
That sounds like it's arguing against the idea of a cookbook.
No, it's not. Because certain people do not know that they have the talent of being a cook. And suddenly they get a cookbook in their hands and they're off to the races. See, the natural talented individual.
Who constitutes a teacher? The hell with a cook.
Well, what do you mean by a teacher?
Somebody who can write a cookbook.
Okay. Right. In the sense of those that can write a cookbook, what you do is you take the books that say they are cookbooks, and you go ahead and cook up the mess or whatever it is that they say that they do, and taste it, and then you can tell immediately if those are real cooks or not.
Okay.
Okay?
I'm up for that.
All right. It's empirical, pragmatic, and if it works, okay. If it doesn't work, try something else.
How do you get somebody else to pay?
You work for football.
You write your cookbook and see. If it sells, they'll taste it.
I've been pushing it, trying to get into this and the thing of losing personal identity, it seems like dying is really scary. And I wonder if there's a particular way of getting around that.
Yes, go ahead and die. What you're talking about is an ego death. It doesn't have anything to do with yourself. The self will continue. If you let go of the ego power trip, let go of the vehicle attachment, then you can move. Now, the first time this happened to me, there was a hell of a lot of fear. It was a very paranoid space, a lot of projection, all the rest of it. But then when when the medical people finally got me back, or thought they got me back, I was told to come back. I was told to come back from some other space. In other words, I was told, as you know, in the center of the cyclone, to go back if I wanted to, or to stay there if I wanted to. But if I stayed there, I'd leave a mess. It'd be a body in a hospital. Somebody had to dispose of that. It's kind of embarrassing at that young an age. And I guess pride brought me back as much as anything else. So I had to come back and work out my pride. When I get rid of my pride, then I can go and it won't make any difference. But you see, you have to consider these questions rather than being afraid of them.
Have you ever seen anything that resembles an ally?
I call them guides.
What's that?
In the center of the cyclone, I talked about allies, but I called them guides. I didn't know about Castaneda's work at all at that point.
Are they similar in the properties?
Pardon?
Are they similar, the entities that you saw, are they similar to Castaneda's description of an ally?
Well, they're similar to what Don Juan's talking about. Castaneda hasn't met his allies yet. He hasn't taken on his ally.
Did you,
He's not a complete warrior yet.
did you see them often?
I wouldn't say see so much as experience. Yes, I'm connected all the time.
Advice, do they give advice on how to live your life like they are supposed to do to their one?
They did when I was naive enough to need it. But when you realize the connection, you no longer need specific information. You go with the flow. You stop the world. You don't look, you see. And those are parts of the connection that I'm talking about. The connection to the essence network. Pardon?
You really connect at all times.
Most of the time. I flunk out every so often. Well, one thing that Patanjali cautions you about, and that is to not to use the psychic powers in the service of your own ego. So does Don Juan. Don Juan says, reduce your self-importance. Erase your private history.
By saying that you look and you don't you see rather than look, you implies that you have more choice. Are you being shown?
It all depends on a feedback system in which you may, for temporary teaching purposes, assume that you have independent initiative. But when you realize the connection fully, you realize there is no such thing as individual initiative whatsoever, and that this is a verbal construct, an illusion. So that William James's statement about these special states of consciousness being separated from the ordinary states of consciousness by the filmiest of screens applies here. The connection is a reality system which is beyond the screen of words. It's a direct experience. Now, you can work with this and open your awareness more and more and go with the flow, become a warrior in the Castaneda sense. Or you can do as Merrill Wolfe has done, which is to accept the Bodhisattva vow, that once you've achieved the connections, your job then is to return and teach, and that you will not leave until every sentient being is in these connected states. Pardon? Yeah, this is sort of an invitation to become a missionary.
Where do you see yourself?
I sometimes wonder. I don't really see myself anymore. Pardon?
Snake into the cave.
Oh, you mean the psychic powers? The Sai Baba materializing gold. Recently he's been materializing only white ashes, I hear. No, this is chalk. I found it up here. No, there's no point. Literally, there is no point in the psychic powers, either in terms of materialization, in terms of mental telepathy, in terms of travel and getting into other people's heads and pushing their energy around. All of these things are network phenomena which, if you take the responsibility of attempting to do, you may succeed, but the price you will be paying is extremely high. Sooner or later, this catches up with you.
Do you ever see yourself as attempting to become the writer of the cookbook without becoming the cook?
I don't know what you mean.
Well, if you haven't reached the state yet where it is your mission to teach, and to write that cookbook.
Well, I'm already guilty of writing a cookbook, 2 of them. Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer is the first cookbook. The second one is The Center of the Cyclone.
Then how do you...
And third one I'm writing currently, and it's called Simulations of Experience, the Science of Belief.
Do you see yourself in the mission then of having achieved that state and being...
No, not in the sense of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is assumed to be a teacher, somebody who's inducing everybody else to get into these states. My mission, as far as I'm concerned, is to develop this into a science in an exploratory way, exploratory technique. It's not to get the maximum number of people into spaces.
Are you taking on graduate students?
You sound like an interesting graduate student.
Thank you.
No, it's important to have skepticism. That means that you have an analytical framework in which you're operating, in which you can evaluate what's going on from your own direct experience in your own direct experiment. And so far as I'm concerned, this is a Western point of view. The other point of view that I was giving is a very Eastern one, in which there is no such thing as the self. Here we believe in the self and we educate the self, and education is a route for, as it were, self-progress, whatever that is.
What do you see as the purpose of man?
What are the alternatives? We could be considered sort of microbes on a mud ball, rotating around the type G star 2/3 of the way from the center of the galaxy to one edge, in a very small galaxy, off in one corner of the universe. Or we can be considered as experimental animals on a small planet, tended by some civilization far beyond ours, with beings far greater than us, who are attempting an experiment in evolution, or some other kind of laboratory thing which we don't yet understand. I often wondered what the monkeys thought about us, and the dolphins.
Do you think that there is a true reality, or a consensus reality, that there's, Eastern mystics speak of there being a true reality? It's just the ego that needs that.
I don't know. So-called absolute reality, with a capital A and a capital R, is a favorite of the Eastern philosophers. It's Kantian, it's Platonian, it's Aristotelian. And yet I feel more like the prisoners in the cave of Plato, that what we consider to be consensus reality is the shadows on the wall. And that if you can move through to these spaces, as apparently Plato did, you can come out in the sunlight and see that which is causing the shadows. Now, this is very hard to get across unless you've been through some experiences of this sort. Unless you've been out of the cave, you can't tell anybody, look, what you're looking at is shadows. But when you've been out of the cave and somebody else has taken an independent trip out of the cave, you can say, yeah, that's a shadow of a goat, and that's a shadow of another kind of man, and that's a shadow of a mountain lion, and so on. And you can describe the causative agent behind the projection of the shadow. Now, of course, this metaphor breaks down very rapidly as soon as you get out of the cave.
Well, I'm wondering if it's a basic need for, say, need for spirit or something, that's a need for a reality that's solid.
All right, why do you assume that need is real? See, your reality, your belief, is that need generates a projection, a simulation, because of the need. A la fantasy in modern psychiatry, a la imagination in modern literature. I ask, what is imagination? What is fantasy? Why partition it off? Why not have a more general concept which includes them as special cases and call it simulation like the modern computers? If you can simulate a large portion of natural processes in a given system, then your science is fairly successful. If you can't simulate successfully, then you don't know enough yet of that particular area of science.
I was just going to ask, in these spaces, it would seem to me that memory isn't sufficient to reconstitute those states.
That's right. All you can remember is the memory trace of the experience, and hence you have a detailed simulation that you don't have without the experience. So that you have, as it were, you're writing your own cookbook. As soon as you've made the dishes and tasted them, you no longer need the cookbook, you can throw it away. Because you know how to do it. And now you can become creative and begin to modify components in along your own pathway.
When you were talking about psychic phenomena, you said that sooner or later the price to pay, they'd have to go simulate
she asks, what are the penalties for the use of the psychic powers? Well, we can give some pretty disastrous examples from World War II. Hitler learned some things about the use of psychic powers, if you wish. And this is pretty obvious. If you study the motion pictures of Hitler's speeches, and you study his personal appearances and so on, obviously some things were going on here which are not immediately obvious. A friend of mine, for instance, was in Berlin listening to him at one point, and she got totally swept up in what he was producing, the effects, in spite of the fact that she didn't know German. Now you can say, well, this is crowd effects, this is multiple feedbacks, and so on and so forth. But if you pay close attention to the kind of people that Hitler swayed, these were not dummies. These were not idiots. He was very convincing to a sufficiently large number of powerful people who were pragmatically on a level keel, and he managed to take them down a very disastrous road. Now, if you want to bring the psychic powers in here, okay. If you say it's all explicable without that, okay. But if you believe in the psychic powers, which Hitler did, according to his biographers, and that these were successfully being used by him, the penalty was pretty high in the long-term human disasters that were a consequence of what he did.
What is the importance to you of isolation?
What do you mean by isolation? She asked, what is the importance to you of isolation?
It's a word you used earlier.
Okay. This has a very definite meaning. This is isolation of the body from as many sources of physical stimulation as one can reduce to zero. In other words, you reduce light to zero, that's easy. You reduce sound to zero, that's a little harder. And you can't reduce gravity to zero and stay on the planet. You have to get into orbit or go out in a gravity-free field. But you can reduce the gravity-resisting forces on a given area of the body. In other words, by floating in water, and especially in, say, about 10 to 20% salt water. So that you can, as it were, free your nervous system up from the necessity of the constant computation of the direction of gravity so that you won't fall. Now, if you try the isolation tank, oh, and the other requirement is an isothermal skin, which you can get by having the water flow very slowly, without stimulation, below the threshold for stimulation due to flow. If you reduce your environment to that extent, we call this physical isolation. Now, you can never reduce everything to zero without getting inside the body. You'll still find residual sources of stimulation going on. Your breathing, your heart, your gut, and your muscles and so on. But you reduce the outside. That's why we call it physical rather than biophysical.
Wouldn't isolation then be the key factor in whether a person uses drugs at a high altitude or whether it's sea level? I suppose that altitude makes no difference. It's just that at 14,000 feet, you don't have streetcars and buses and trains. Whereas at sea
Good
level,
point. You're reducing the stimulation by going high.
and at altitude has, well, you can do the same thing in Death Valley in the middle of summer at 140 degrees.
Okay, now you can go to Death Valley and get your silence, get your isolation from stimulation, and then you can go directly from there, and the trip is only about 40 miles, to Mount Whitney and get to 14,000 feet. Now do this in the summer, and I think you'll see that there's quite a difference. Now the trouble is, of course, we're changing temperature too. Pardon?
We'll do it in the winter to find the mountains cold.
Yeah, I know. But you can't control this temperature variable here. But if you get a motor home and drive to the top of Mount Everest, you advantage of the motorhome is this. At Mount Evans, for example, you can drive to 14,100 feet, odd feet. And you can stay there in the motorhome. You can turn on the furnace and keep the temperature right.
So that oxygen has some place.
Right.
Amount of oxygen.
I think the amount of oxygen does have
Well,
a...
then if you could get the same limiting amount of oxygen in death valve below sea level, the oxygen would make absolutely no difference. I mean, just the isolated amount of oxygen.
A good experiment. When are you going to do it?
I won't bother with altitude.
Okay. If you can rule out altitude, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, Abe Maslow talks about growth motivation. Can you place that somewhere on your schema of states, like plus or minus 12 or 24?
No.
What do you think about
Growth motivation is not a state of consciousness.
Okay. Peak
It's
experience?
part of self.
What about peak experiences? That isn't either?
Peak experience is change of state of consciousness.
As he described here.
Right.
Well, okay, I don't understand this because if I understand him correctly, he's saying that in a peak experience you're motivated by what he calls growth motivators.
Okay, the trouble with Maslow's formulation is that it's done at a particular time, at a particular place, with particular people. So what he says is that you can only maintain the state of consciousness a short period of time, and that's your peak. Merrill Wolff says, no, you can go up here and hold it as long as you want to. You can do an inverse Maslow and come down every so often.
What's your experience told you about reincarnation? Do you see any need to re-enter the vessel of the body for more growth experiences?
I've been through experiences, direct experiences of apparent repetitions of past lives, but there are phenomena within one's own nervous system, as we well know. The whole thing operates as a feedback system with multiple loops interconnected. Now, if you get going around a sufficient number of those loops and come back through certain memories again and again with slight modifications, it can be as if you're living through past lives that were slightly different from yours. So that within the simulation space, there are experiences, as it were, possible experiences, which could account for the basic postulate of a reincarnation. I'm not saying that this is decisive in any sense. I'm saying just to entertain that as an alternate. One alternative.
Does Merrill Wolff say anything about that?
Yeah, that's where the Bodhisattva Va comes from. On the next reincarnation, he's going to have to teach.
Would you care to comment on the experiences of U.S. astronauts having things they talk about when they get back?
Yeah. Ed Mitchell recently gave a talk to I think it's the Adolf Schmidt Society. I don't know what that is. But his talk was Consciousness, the Ultimate Enigma. And in the talk, he sent me a copy of it recently. Apparently he got wind of the book. In the talk, he says that when he was doing an extravehicular job and saw the Earth floating in empty space, he himself was floating in empty space also, but he saw the white, green, and blue orb of his own planet against the black velvet of the night sky, that he suddenly realized that the most precious thing that a human being has is his consciousness. No matter where it came from, no matter what it is. And that right there is when he realized that this is the ultimate enigma. Now, this is a hard-headed engineering type with a lot of natural science background who suddenly is getting into a quite mystical and poetic space as a consequence of a reality situation which few people have seen and been in yet.
I believe he also stated something to the effect that there wasn't a single other astronaut that he knew of that had been through the outer space experience that hadn't come back what he termed a significantly changed individual.
Right.
We've been hired.
NASA's been trying to keep this under wraps for some time. I had the opportunity of interviewing a couple of them right after they came back down at Houston. And it was obvious. These guys were really put into a stone thinking space irrespective of what they wanted. It's a very, very powerful method. And very expensive. Way back there. Emotion, feeling, yeah. What do you want from it?
I'm just wondering if does it have the same kind of meaning it has in the, in the present place? Most of it start off.
No, it's far more important. Becomes the total content of your consciousness at times in some of these spaces. Yeah, there's somebody standing up there with a hand up.
Any evidence of other animals in space, such as dolphins, which seem to be together with rabbits?
As far as I could make out, every time I tried to get in the head of a dolphin, it was stone thinking was about all I got. I don't know what they're eating, but or what their techniques are or anything of that sort. But they apparently are living in this region. So are the whales. Programming is the cookbook. The injunctive use of language in order to give you the steps. A set of steps. It may not be the proper set of steps for you. You may not have the right stove.
Let's assume that dolphins and other animals are in a natural state or whatever of stone thinking. Why would it be that we aren't? Is it like symbolic language or self-consciousness, or what do you think about that?
Well, why aren't you?
Why aren't most people, is what I'm saying.
I can't speak for most people. I can only speak for myself. You can only speak for yourself in this region. Why aren't you?
You're assuming I'm not.
If you were, you wouldn't ask the question.
Why did I start out? I did start out in a okay, plus or minus 48 for years and years. You want to put it in that terminology.
Okay,
And,
go ahead.
And somehow I get the feeling that maybe dolphins don't.
Don't what?
Start out in a state of plus or minus 48, and thereafter have to learn to reach special states, and find it unnatural in the process, and something that they You understand?
You mean they have the same stupid impedances to getting these spaces that we have?
No, I don't think so. You understand what I'm
Okay.
saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Okay.
I think that the baby dolphin, for example, I've watched them being born, and I've watched what happens for 4 days after birth. And it's an incredible thing that they learn in the 4 days. The first thing they have to learn is where the air is. First thing they can do is swim. And their little old tail goes like that, but the swimming has no direction to it. So the mother directs the swimming. She directs them to the surface for the first breath. About the third breath, she no longer has to show them where the air is. Then she has to, when there are objects in the little dolphin's way, she has to show them, that you're going to run into this particular thing like a window that he wants to swim through. She has to get there just ahead of him, turn him just enough so he won't break his little nose against the glass. Turn at an angle, but not do away completely with his contact with the glass, but to realize the reality of the glass. And so on. She has to teach him where the milk is. So he'll swim in the right place so that every 15 minutes he can get tanked up.
So are you saying that maybe our social system isn't teaching the right things?
Maybe most of it don't live to adulthood. Dolphins do.
Well, the main thing seems to be the dolphins live in an environment in which they cannot modify very much of the environment. They have to accept it. They have to accept that the fish swim in schools, they have to go find the fish. They aren't farmers. They can't eat seaweed. They don't have a cecum. They are definitely protein-bound creatures. The protein has to be formed in other organisms, so they... Well, remember, the mother is being run by this environment also. And if a dolphin is being born in the presence of sharks, the rest of the colony stays around and keeps the area free of sharks while the blood is coming into the water. A lone dolphin is a dead dolphin. When you're only 8 feet long in the sea, you can get eaten if you're alone. It's a very dangerous situation. When you grow up to, say, 60 feet or 80 feet and you're a sperm whale, then you can afford to be alone.
I think part of an answer to your question about why is it that we're not stoned from birth.
Maybe, we are.
Well, all right, maybe we're stoned from birth, but...
We become unstoned.
We learn not to be stoned.
So we get unstoned
Right.
in the process of being positively and negatively reinforced so that we'll fit into the social situation.
Here's the state of the child. He gets taken out of it every so often.
Yeah, I mean...
And then it gets reversed in the adult.
It seems to me that like a spanking might be one of those chasm experiences, and it teaches you to
Right.
Okay,
headache.
if I put my own words on it, try to clarify it, would you say that, like, if you had a child and you were raising a child, you would try to raise him like a let-be philosophy, like Tao or whatever?
Well, that's been tried and doesn't work because then somebody else steps in.
Well, okay, you have to take him out of our social system, obviously. Put him in a public school in California.
I don't have any ready answers to this. I think that the important thing is to maintain this sort of a state insofar as one can, but also to teach this sort of thing in inverse Maslow. Then you won't have to teach this later.
Okay.
Could you explain again why that state, that plateau, along as well as the direction that the cookbook leads you to, is not homeostatic?
What do you mean by homeostatic?
By there being positive balance for you to achieve the same state continually.
Well, these states are not outside the physiological homeostasis for the human organism, obviously, or they would lead to death. The steady states, the homeostatic mechanisms of the body are, say, up here and down here, and you can operate in any place in between them and still be within your homeostatic limit.
Could your consciousness then be bound by your body?
The body imposes definite limits in non-isolation situations. In contrast, the province of the mind, where there are no limits.
Do you feel that all creatures or all sentient beings are born in the state of frustration, and that humans have, through a series of alienations, separated themselves from them?
Yes, but they aren't necessarily conscious that they're in state plus 3. As long as nothing interferes, yes. But you can get an outside interference, and if you get an episode of this sort, which brings you out of plus 3, and then back up again, you're suddenly conscious of the fact there is such a thing as plus 3, whereas here you didn't know that.
Is it possible that you can get something that takes you out of plus 3 and you can never return to it? In other words,
If that's your belief, that such things exist, yes.
Would death be an ultimate plus 3?
I haven't got yet. I'll let you know later.
Getting back to this issue of psychic power, Swami Rama and also Paramahansa Yogananda talked about using certain prana forces or certain energy
doing things like levitate moving objects, or could you comment on possible, they consider that a form of perfection. Is there really a cost or is it detrimental to the person?
All right, I'm a Western skeptic. And I want a demonstration of the levitation when I'm not in an isolation situation in which I'm in plus minus 48 and observing the consensus reality view of a particular body in a gravitational field without the introduction of physical forces which could do the levitation. I'm still skeptical about psychic powers in the area, number one, of materialization, and number two, levitation. I'm not skeptical in regard to mental telepathy, that kind of experience I've had directly. I can't explain it. I don't know what the exchange mechanism is. I don't know what is traveling from one person to another, but I know that things do travel, information that you can't get any other way.
Yeah, I was wondering about anything about states of consciousness of so-called mentally abnormal people.
Well, I agree with Thomas Zaz that a good deal of the diagnosis and a good deal of the terminology used in psychiatry is adventitious. And that this is a system of social control for those who deviate too far from a norm which is very arbitrary. If you want to get quickly locked up in a mental hospital, you cause either your relatives or your neighbors a lot of trouble. So it's a social control mechanism, keeping violence and various distasteful forms of behavior out of the community.
And what about unidentified consciousness?
Well, that's just beginning to be investigated, and if you follow R.D. Lang, Zaz, and various people who are investigating this state of consciousness, you can hardly separate the so-called schizophrenic states from the mystical states, except the schizophrenic tends to go on bummers more often than the mystic.
Is there any similarities or differences between where you're at and where Dianetics and Scientology are at?
I don't know where Dianetics and Scientology currently are, because I haven't been in the area. I read the original book when it came out in 1950, and it's straight stuff in the original text. Now, I don't know where they are now.
Concerning the detachment of the consciousness from the body, did you find in the studies that women are equally able as men to detach their consciousness from their body?
Well, I can't speak for the women. Are there any women here that would like to speak to that?
Now, I would like to know too, because I think there are differences in getting stoned, getting detached from the body.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Tony will answer you.
I think that the difference is the difference between the yang and the yin energy. You see, the yang energy is not as receptive as quality. So often when people say that men are not as sensitive or intuitive, I never go along with that because I don't understand that term. I just think the energy is more yang. That's a better way of saying it. The sensitivity and the intuition is just a different quality.
I mean, specifically concerning consciousness, separation, mind, body.
It's a different quality to the trick they're taking. So, the female, oh yes, of course.
Some of the most talented people that I know of are women in regard to getting out of the body. Though the ones that write it up are the men. Robert Monroe in Journeys Out of the Body, for example. There's a good cookbook for some people. You had a question?
Yes. I'd like to ask, do you see in the evolution of possibly a much more direct and better language for reaching states of consciousness other than the limited language that we're using today, such as better possible language such as computer or music or something else,
Right.
I think.
Yes, I feel that this is an evolution that's coming, and that is that if you want a new science, you must construct, as it were, theoretical grounds on which that operates, and hence construct a language. Now, to make it very specific, Einstein writes that he knew relativity as a set of ideas which he had very great difficulty in expressing until he found tensors, the mathematics known as tensors. And as soon as he found that, he suddenly realized that here was a mathematics that fit the ideas, and he could now subject the ideas, put them out in a quantitative form where they were testable. We don't have that in regard to consciousnesses yet, as far as I can make out. We're still struggling with very primitive, sort of naturalistic, subjective description. So we don't have the essential dynamic, the essential energy, the essential description that's necessary to write an effective cookbook, a really effective one that can be shared across the board. The way we can, say, in physics, in regard to relativity theory, or how to construct a bomb.
But do you think that could ever be a language of words?
Pardon?
Could that ever be a language of words?
A language of words. Well, as you know, if you've studied linguistics, the native languages are mysteries of themselves. They're immensely complex instruments. And the exploration of language itself is proceeding apace. If you take Chomsky's embedded grammar and various things of this sort, and where meaning comes from, and what definition is, and all the rest of this. This is basic to mathematics as well as to the common garden variety of language. So that picking out that which is necessary for a cookbook of changes of state of consciousness is the job to be done. It hasn't been done yet, as far as I can make out. Let's see, let's have one more question, and then we'll call a halt.
How do you define intelligence? You were talking about Hitler having the influence over intelligent people, and you do not continue to define intelligence. Rather than these people were stupid or unable to think independently.
Well, I don't think you can call the whole German nation stupid.
Well, it's not the whole German nation, some 2 or 3 million at least of the German nation who I'm sure weren't stupid and deserved intelligence.
Right. Well, I don't want to get embroiled in a discussion of World War II at this point. What is intelligence? Well, I'm going to leave that up to the professionals that are interested in measuring intelligence. I would prefer to use an intuitive approach to this. That's where I'm at this point. Attempts to measure intelligence and using IQ and the rest of this in the past have turned out to be very limiting kinds of things. I know that, for instance, the Stanford Binet and various other things that were called intelligence tests were really an intelligence test of the guy who designed the test rather than the people who took it.
In a lot of third world countries of the world where Western science has not predominated, there are a lot of people who have exchanged the states of consciousness, and that they groups of people that went on the same conscious trip into to your void. I do believe is this not let me say it like this. Is there a difference between everyone having all the states of consciousness and they go to one entity or energy that we all share from, or is it that everyone can parallel and duplicate all the states of consciousness that other people have? Because there are instances where 2 altered states of consciousness be sharing the same times and the same spaces at the same time, and they become one. And
well, the ultimate scientific enigma is whether everything that I've been talking about is happening just inside one head, or whether there is a connection with some other forces, some other energies, some other entities, some other civilizations, some other intelligences in the universe. Is there a connection or isn't there? That is the basic question that we have to answer in this particular science.
Okay, well, like,
I don't know the answer.
personally, like, I have been in altered states of consciousness where other people have too, and we have been at the same time and the same space, and have realized it, and have
Okay.
realized that we were, in fact, one entity.
All right, now how do you get around what we call parallel programming? In other words, if you all agree on a particular program, you ultimately will end up in the similar states of consciousness. In other words, if you are giving one another directions sufficiently strongly within the group, as I talk about in the Kairos workshop in the Center of the Cyclone.
But you don't mean verbal language, though.
Every kind of communication that you can do. Nonverbal, verbal, esoteric, whatever you wish. Everything you can do parallel programming.
But what if you surprise, if particular surprise? It's something like if you're, you know, it happens first, and then you realize it, and then the element of unsurety and insecurity allows you to withdraw real quick because you realize that you have reached a state where you've merged into the same times and places of another consciousness, and that consciousness was there with you, and they were realizing it, and you separated it.
Well,
out of, you know,
the test
out
of the
fear first, and then realize that you shouldn't have, and you can't get back to it because you're trying to do it on purpose. That's what I'm saying.
Well, the test of the pudding is in the eating. If you've had direct experience of this sort, and you want to test it and reproduce it and make it repeatable without subtle parallel programming, you know, running controls here is a very difficult thing. Designing them is very difficult. And the details of this are, you would have to set up physical isolation controls and non-acquainted people who had never seen one another before, and they're in isolation environments, and can they run parallel by esoteric means? So, the proper controls haven't been done, the proper experiments haven't been done to settle this one way or the other.
Yeah,
There are
but
still
the actual
leakages
thing-
through the physical medium, lots of leakages, about which a lot of people aren't aware. And running controls, for instance, in drug research, in medicine, where I had to design various types of things, to get rid of the cross-programming and the parallel programming, it's almost impossible. There is some leakage through the structure of the society in which you live. There are all kinds of things going on here which are very subtle. And finding these sources and eliminating them is the isolation problem. Isolating your preparation, as they say in science. Okay, I'm going to have to stop.